Welcome back to Social Psychology. We're going to talk about some highlights from the persuasion section of our course. So let's go ahead and get started. When we're talking about persuasion here in this context, we're talking about any sort of message or effort to try to change beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. So we'll use a lot of examples from advertising, public health campaigns, electoral politics or elections. Um, but there's also lots of other sort of subtle ways that we might encounter persuasion in our lives, right? Most of the time we're talking about fairly intentional examples like we just gave. Okay, first question to start us out. Some people say they don't pay attention to ads, so they're not affected by them. And I think a lot of us have this experience of like, I'm not affected by ads, right? Or attempts to persuade me. How well do you think that works? The not paying attention part. So let's keep this question, keep it in mind as we walk through some highlights from chapter 8. I ask here, do you have any favorite ads? One that is sort of recent was from the New York Public Health Department, I think, their campaign to try to get people to wear masks during the coronavirus pandemic. And so they showed depictions of that guy, right? That guy who's going against all the norms and going against the guidelines and annoying everybody. And in this case, he's kind of clueless. And the idea here is that you don't want to be that guy, right? One of the things that I think is kind of helpful or illustrative about that ad, and it was a video, not just still images there, but it helps to illustrate some of this idea that what matters in terms of persuasion is the impact of the persuasive message rather than the message itself. So the way it leaves us thinking and feeling after we've watched it or experienced it is way more important than what is in the ad itself, right? So the idea with that guy ad is probably that they wanted to have people walk away and feel like, well, I don't want to be that guy, right? I'm going to avoid doing that with a little bit of humor, right? Like take some of the edge off, because kind of scary times during a pandemic. Adding a little humor might be okay, although sometimes that backfires, right? And people are offended. So if you were offended by that ad, that probably wouldn't be a helpful effect to leave on you, right? But if you felt like, yeah, I don't want to be that guy, right? That's a helpful place to land according to the people who designed the ad. So there are a couple of different models we're going to talk about in terms of persuasion. The first one is very influential. It's referred to as the elaboration likelihood model, and that says that it's not so much how much or what the message is, right? But it's how much we elaborate on it in our minds, how much it sticks with us, how much it grows over time, even if we forget that we ever experienced the message in the first place. So according to the elaboration likelihood model, we have two paths to persuasion. Like we have two different processes. You can kind of think about like when we talked about automatic versus controlled processing. This is another way of thinking about how we process information in one of two ways. And one way, the central route to persuasion, tends to focus on things or tends to work well. The messages that work well in the central route tend to be factual, logical. They tend to make clear arguments. And so messages that are effective in our central route are sort of, I think, classically persuasive things. Like somebody made a strong argument, they gave me a bunch of facts, and I said, yep, that makes sense, right? That's the central route to persuasion, and it is described here above. And the idea with this central route is that the route that we use depends on the person, depends on what state we're in or what environment we're in. So if we are highly motivated, interested, and able to think about the message or the issue, we're probably going to use our central route. If we are not motivated, like maybe we're tired, we're distracted, right? Or if we're not equipped, we don't have the background to understand what they're talking about, then we tend to use the peripheral route. So when you have an actively engaged, interested audience paying attention, motivated to understand things, central route, logical, rational arguments, facts, great way to go to be persuasive. When we are not so motivated, when we're distracted, when we don't quite know what's going on, when we're not fully engaged, we tend to process things using the peripheral route. So the peripheral route, the messages that tend to be effective there tend to focus on cues that trigger acceptance without much thinking. So the easy things to say yes to. What that means is that all that automatic processing, all those heuristics that we've talked about and automatic or implicit associations help with processing things in the peripheral route. So an attractive person says this product is a good thing, and I go, my feeling of positivity towards that product grows just a little bit. One of my favorite at all time, I hope they continue to make them, are toothpaste commercials, because they say things like 9 out of 10 dentists agree that Crest, Colgate, Aquafresh. Have you ever noticed all dentists all agree that all the toothpaste are the best? I imagine that's in part because dentists really want you to brush your teeth, right? They don't care what toothpaste you use as long as you're using a legit toothpaste, and probably the toothbrush and floss are more important. But that seeing that supposed dentist, who's actually an actor in a lab coat, saying this is a great toothpaste, we go, and we sometimes have more positive associations with that brand of toothpaste. You might have heard stories too of companies who will sometimes pay individuals to stand in line for a product, because if everybody's willing to stand in line for it, it must be really popular. Everybody's doing it. That social normative influence, like, yeah, okay, I'll go along with that, right? The peripheral route, however, is not as powerful or long-lasting as the central route. So when we process things in the peripheral route, it tends to be less impactful on us. Okay? When we process things in the central route, that tends to lead to more longer-lasting, more powerful change, which, I don't know, gives me some peace, right? A little bit of that makes sense, that we would probably make stronger connections in the central route. So you might have noticed I used a couple different words for each of the routes there. I was talking in terms of the elaboration likelihood model. The heuristic systematic model says very similar things as the elaboration likelihood model, but they swap out heuristic for peripheral and systematic for central. You can use those terms in this class for our purposes. You are welcome to use those interchangeably. There we go, depicted there. Another way to think about and potentially analyze persuasive messages is to use the Yale School approach, which I think is pretty intuitive. It's the who, what, and whom. So the Yale School approach says that the persuasive messages themselves have 3 really important components. And let's look at a couple of examples of each of these. So the who, or the source component, includes things like who is the communicator, right? So in the dentist or the toothpaste, in the toothpaste commercial, the supposed dentist is the communicator, right? Usually a slightly middle-aged looking guy, white guy, usually in a lab coat, and wearing the lab coat probably gives him a slight increase in our perception of credibility. So the degree to which we perceive the communicator as credible, that would make a difference in a message's persuasive impact. And credibility here means they are knowledgeable and trustworthy, right? Those seem to be the 2 basic component parts that make up credibility. What's interesting, though, is that source credibility doesn't always have a uniform impact. So over time, the credibility of the source, the importance of that is often diminished. So we often hear a message that might not have a credible source attached to it, and we don't think much of it. But over time, we remember the impact of the message. Like I remember different points in time, diet soda, like Diet Coke. Is it healthy for you? Is it bad for you? And or different skincare products. Or is it worthwhile to go to this kind of school and pay that much more money, right? And we hear these different kinds of stories, and sometimes news reports, studies, right? We often remember oh, it's not worth it to go pay this much more to go to that private kind of school because, you don't get the bang for your buck. We often remember the message or the impact of the message, that conclusion I just made, more so than we remember the source. That source could have been a really uncredible source. So an uncredible source often, and sometimes they call it source amnesia, we forget where we heard it, but we remember the message. And this is how for a long time I continued to drink Diet Coke and try to convince myself it was fine, right? Um, I mean, maybe it's fine. That's up to you to decide, but there's clearly some indications that it's not healthy and it's probably not worth it. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with source credibility and the sleeper effect. That's what I'm describing there, right? I might hear something about how, don't use sunscreen, or don't use, don't bother going to college because it doesn't help you get ahead in life. It's not worth the money. And I think this is just maybe a person calling in to a show that I'm listening to. But over time, that person's message might actually stick with me, even though they have no credibility about it. Right? Stick with your college plans. You're doing good. Okay, certainty. This refers to the certainty expressed by the communicator. So somebody who is very certain about what they say tends to be more persuasive. Are they more credible if they're more certain? No. Those are two separate things. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But we are often more persuaded when somebody is sure about what they're talking about. You might connect this back to other discussions like eyewitness memory, right? There are all sorts of times when this doesn't work out well for us. And then attractiveness. We tend to be more persuaded by people who are more attractive, prototypically attractive, right? Well-groomed and have good lighting and all those sorts of things. Now, does that really matter? Does that make them more knowledgeable or trustworthy or expert? No, but it's one of those heuristic kinds of experiences. So the communicator is one example of who or a source characteristic. A what or content characteristic includes things like what is actually in the persuasive message. So you might think about the most interesting man in the world, or examples of vivid personal experiences. So when messages tend to be more vivid, they tend to focus on an individual person, a compelling story. That tends to stick with us more than generalities and facts and figures, right? So for example, people might be trying to figure out what is the seriousness of, I don't know, climate change or a healthcare crisis or the opioid epidemic or any sort of thing. And we might hear facts and figures about, 20% of people experience this, or so many thousands of people have died from that. That's one thing, but it actually tends to be more persuasive to talk about a particular person who lost their family member to an opioid addiction, for example. That tends to be more impactful, more persuasive than if we talk about how, in the past few years, more than 40,000 people in the United States, well more, die. If I have that number correct, from opioid related causes. But the story of that one person often makes a more lasting impression. So what is in the content of the message can also make a difference. Sometimes people try to use fear, which is kind of like, it seems related to vividness, right? If you make people feel fearful, then one of the potential negative consequences to that, if you're trying to make a persuasive message, is that it can backfire and make people resistant, people shut down, right? So we might think about things like the Feinberg and Willer paper and those dire messages. Those are fear-based messages. There was a study that tested the effectiveness of different messages on trying to get women to come in for routine mammograms for cancer screening. And they sent one of two kinds of messages. One is that not getting a mammogram could cost you your life. It's a fear-based message. Or, cancer's really out there, but getting a mammogram could actually save your life. So proposing a solution to the feared outcome is the most effective way to use a fear-based message. So if you can help people understand how they can avoid the thing that elicits the fear, a fear-based message can be pretty darn persuasive. This gets used, I like to use examples from past political campaigns because they're past, but you see they're repeated, right? All of these things we could find in commercials for people running for office or trying to get a ballot measure passed, for example. From a past presidential campaign, there was a big ad out about how Obama, if he was elected, was going to release the terrorists from Guantanamo Bay and move them into a neighborhood near you. Of course, he didn't do that. It's hard to imagine a president who would take people out of prison and just release them into the community and have them lurking behind your picket fences. But instilling the fear, right, about it and making people feel like, oh my goodness, if we elect fill in the blank, these terrible things will happen, right? One that has been relatively recent is that one of the presidential candidates will get rid of suburbs. So really kind of a bizarre, we'll talk about bizarre messages too. But that's a very fear-based reaction, fear-based message. What's the solution? Vote for this other candidate, right? Okay, so we're still in the message content or the what. If we think about discrepancy, which is another way to talk about that sort of outlandish or an extreme position, only people who are perceived as pretty highly credible communicators can pull off sending a very discrepant message. So people who already, if a group of people already believe them, they're on board, they have a lot of trust in that person, then that person can say something pretty extreme and people will continue to go with it. In a past presidential campaign, it was for a campaign for a presidential nomination, Newt Gingrich claimed that he would get the United States to have a colony on the moon within 10 years if he was elected president. Now, and then of course people made all sorts of funny pictures about him being, out in outer space. But that actually didn't hurt his campaign because the people who were interested in supporting him believed in what he had done and saw, had been following him for years. He had quite a career in Washington, D.C. They thought, probably will take more than 10 years, but he can do it. If anybody can do it, Newt can, right? Another possibility with message content is we can make a one-sided or a two-sided appeal. A one-sided appeal is when we make a persuasive pitch and only present our side, right? Like we're going to put a colony, human populated colony on the moon starting tomorrow, right? If people already agree with me, if I'm talking to the people who already agree with me, that works out fine. But if people are aware of counter arguments, then a two-sided appeal tends to be more effective. I want to switch gears and give you an example of everyday life kind of persuasion, because sometimes we'll go in, and if you talk to your supervisor in person about these things, you might go into work and say, hey, I was thinking, could I have Saturday off? I've got this thing going on. It's really important to me, right? And imagine it's a wedding, or it's a something really important in your life, right? That's a one-sided appeal. If you go in and say, hey, I know it's really hard to take Saturdays off with such short notice, but I'm sure I can get somebody to cover for me. Could I get Saturday off? That's a two-sided appeal because we've addressed the counter argument that would usually come. I know it's really hard, or it's against the rules, or it's hard to find coverage for that, right? That's the kind of opposing message that I'm trying to deal with. And so I put that out there because the supervisor is going to know that, right? Most likely. And make my request, make my appeal, while also dealing with it. Now, why would you say no, right? Your supervisor could still say no. But to increase the likelihood of getting that day off, I recommended the two-sided appeal for that particular example. Whom is audience, who the audience is, or who the target is of the communication or the persuasive message. And we can think about individuals and different audiences have different characteristics. Some people have more of a need for cognition. They like to think about things critically and get in the weeds about things. And some people have a relatively lower need for cognition. They don't want to think about all the complexities and stuff, right? Well, depending on your audience, you might want to change the message to suit their individual preferences. Age of the audience, what mood people are likely to be in. And we'll get with mood in just a second. So analytical people tend to prefer more rational appeals, even if it's just the framing, the way we talk about things in more intellectual ways. Some people like that. Other people are turned off by it, right? And then thinking about feelings and moods, people who are in more positive moods tend to make faster, more impulsive decisions based on peripheral cues, which often works well for lots of things, including sales and elections and getting donations, if you're collecting donations for charity or things like that. We often see a lot of guilt tripping in persuasive appeals. That can work, but generally speaking, if you want people to go along with a message, helping them feel more positively tends to work better, more consistently, I should say, more consistently works. I want to share with you, and I know videos are hard to share here, but this one's very brief. Hopefully it won't be too loud, but this is an advertisement. So what might make that ad work? How could you look at all those cute animals? Some of them are babies, right? Doing adorable things. That will put a lot of people in a more positive emotional state. And then that positive emotional state gets associated with the Android, right? Now, what kind of cell phone do you think I have? If you're really curious, you can make your guess. Let me know. I'll let you know. I'll let you know and send you proof if you want it. Okay, so we're talking about the audience. A couple more target or audience factors, how old they are. When we think about things like politics, we often hear that older people are more conservative, younger people are more progressive or liberal. That's a life cycle explanation. Like sometimes people will say, "Oh, when you get older, you'll see, and you'll get more conservative." It tends to be instead that people form their political attitudes and a whole bunch of other attitudes fairly early in life, and they tend to get more stable and consistent as people age. And so actually it doesn't seem that people on average get more conservative as they get older, but that different generations have slightly different trends in their political and other kinds of attitudes. Um, Also, if the audience is expecting to be persuaded, then their defenses can be up, they're forewarned, and they're less likely to be persuadable. So catching people off guard, like even with simple things like playing music in the background of an ad or playing music in the background of like a person making a big persuasive speech, that sort of distraction takes up some of our cognitive resources, and then we're less likely to be able to marshal our defenses against that persuasive message. So all these things we're talking about, one of the things that I think is important to highlight here as we're introducing and talking about some of these persuasion concepts is that we are capable of being aware of what persuades us much of the time, right? And that's what we mean by metacognition. So if we're open to it and we have some awareness of how persuasion works, we can also spot when we're being persuaded, right? Now, why is that important? It gives us a little window of opportunity to change an approach, to recognize like, oh, those are peripheral root factors. I don't know if I want to um, invest my money or invest my educational time or invest my relationship into that particular experience, right? Or that thing that somebody's trying to persuade me towards. We have a chance then to track how we're being persuaded or not, and to be open to something different. So let's pause here. Let me know what questions you have, what thoughts you have, what sorts of things. Maybe we didn't cover something that you have a question about. Please be sure to let me know. And thanks so much for being with me here.